All right. There's a tiny pause before I get started. It's like giving me a millennial pause. Okay. I'm going to talk very precisely about my academic field in this. I may write this up more formally later, but I feel like it's a relatively simple point to make, even if I'm probably going to yap for a really long time about it. I used to believe in the idea that I'm refuting here, or not entirely refuting, but like mostly the sort of foundational aspect of it, I will be going against pretty hard. Okay, so the idea recently that a bunch of sort of European folklore monsters come from anti-Semitism, that idea has spread pretty widely, especially because of one or two easily shareable like infographics or whatever. I think a couple of popular Jewish outlets have written stuff specifically on vampires and witches. The witch connection is a lot. That it's a lot. Just period. It's a lot more relevant. It's also something I've studied. I won't go there. It is a complicated enough topic that I cut 2 chapters from my dissertation because I couldn't handle it. So maybe I'll write about that. It might be interesting to talk about why I cut like a half my planned dissertation. But the idea that vampires come from anti-Semitism or like vampire folklore comes from anti-Semitism is not true. And I used to think it was at least somewhat more true. I'm terminally moderate on everything, but I used to buy into it a little bit more than I do now. So I want to talk about that. Now, why might people think of vampires and Jews in one sentence, or like folklore vampires? So, quick refresh on what folklore vampires were. In the first place, I've written about this in another post on here that's a text post. I think it may actually be my longest post. Uh, I'll link that in the show notes or whatever you want to call them. But folklore vampires were undead critters. They would usually be sort of a malcontent in life. A disease would strike a village. They'd see, oh, well, this malcontent died recently, possibly a vampire. And so they'd dig them up. If the decay didn't make sense to the villagers, then they would think they've caught their culprit. Um, so it's that's what that is. Very different, and this is important. Very different from your later dudes like Dracula. Very different from your later dudes like anybody in vampire fiction for the most part. So basic refresh there. A couple of things would probably leap to a viewer reader's mind when thinking of vampire folklore and anti-Semitism. One is the blood libel. Vampires drink blood. Surely that has to do with the blood libel. Another thing could be the myth of the wandering Jew, which is this sort of anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic folk thing about how there was a Jew who mocked Jesus en route to his crucifixion, and this Jew was cursed to wander the earth forever. It's kind of like a Cain. It's giving Cain. Uh, so there's that, the idea of perpetually suffering, wandering thing. And that wandering Jew does show up explicitly in Gothic literature, but again, that is later than the folklore. So, not going to say too much on the wandering Jew thing, it's a looser connection. But the blood libel is the one that people really specifically come back to that may be relevant to the folklore. A lot of other stuff people bring up really has nothing to do with the folklore. I mean, the idea that vampires are these sorts of exploitative rich people, whatever, that is not in the folklore. Uh, Again, in that other post, I talked about how that comes up in a fairly bad, early, and influential British journalist interpretation of vampire folklore. Maybe comes from that. He draws this parallel of like, well, these Eastern Europeans, they talk about vampires while we call people bloodsuckers here, and that we call like exploitative rich people bloodsuckers. So that's the connection, but again, it's not in the folklore. So the real narrowing down, really, the idea is blood libel and just generally sort of creepy or whatever. Any sort of idea of the appearance being similar, like stereotypical Jewish appearance, stereotypical folklore vampire appearance, also not relevant, not even worth really engaging with, because the folkloric vampire was kind of this ruddy, bloated, ugly corpse thing, and it was the corpse of somebody who was in the village. So no intrusion of sort of anti anti-Semitic tropes there. So, separating out folklore from literature, all we've got is the blood libel. Blood libel, for those who are maybe less familiar, I've also written about the resurgence of the blood libel. I will link that in the show notes as well. The blood libel is the idea that Jews sacrifice Christian children for their blood for ritual purposes, either to bake it into matzah or to drink it to deal with the other kinds of curses the Jews allegedly have. The idea that Jewish males menstruate plays into this and need to like replenish their cursed blood or whatever. It's very stupid, but that's what the blood libel is. It originated in England uh, in the High Middle Ages, or I'm actually not familiar with what's called the High Middle Ages in England. I don't really know. Middle Ages. Um, so the blood libel connects Jews to blood sucking, or not really blood sucking, but like blood consumption, human blood consumption. There's a number of reasons why this isn't really a plausible connection with the folkloric vampire. Um, this is a distinctly, say, like Christian anti-Semitic belief. It has a lot to do with clash of religions, things like that. Um, whereas vampire folklore, the sort of Christian elements of vampire folklore feel a little bit tacked on if you've read a lot of accounts of these vampire allegations, incidents, or whatever. Like crosses come up, however, crosses also feature in other traditions with different meanings. And some scholars pretty plausibly argue that vampire folklore is either like a totally pre-Christian pagan thing, or just given certain reasons, geography and whatever, scholars sometimes argue that vampires have their root in Manichaean folklore. If you're familiar with Manichaeism, good for you. I'm not going to go into it too much here. And they certainly would have known what Jews are, Manichaeans would. But basically, there's no reason to think that a consistently Christian anti Judaism sort of concept would feature at this very like foundational level of folklore. Um, and one might argue, well, it crept in later. Still, when there's these sorts of vampire incidents before vampire literature, they definitely would have known who Jews are. But from looking at tons and tons of accounts, there's not really much reason to. There's a vague reference to Jews in a minor incident thing. Nick Grooms talks about this, but the connection of blood libel to vampires seems hard to support. I need to see a lot more textual support for that. It makes sort of like what we might call phenomenological sense. Talking about influences, there's these sorts of looser sort of ideas or parallel thing. Um, it sort of maybe makes sense, except for what I'm about to say, which is that bloodsucking prior to the like 18th century wasn't the really distinct thing with a vampire. We don't really know where the word vampire comes from. People might say otherwise. Recent scholarship, they probably just haven't read. We don't really know where the word comes from. You might, I probably used to intuitively sort of assume that vampire comes from some sort of word for bloodsucking. That's not quite the case. Vampires were also known to, or thought, known, whatever. These sorts of folklore vampires were thought to strangle people, sexually assault people, specifically women. I mean, they did a whole lot of different routes of attack. Some of the sort of medieval predecessors to vampires uh, would just kind of harass people. That's another thing they kind of did. They were, think of it more like a very a very touchy feely poltergeist, I guess. Um, I think in the previous post I wrote about this, I talked about how Frankenstein's monster is very much sort of vampire coded, and part of that is that he leaves finger marks on the necks of people he strangles. That is also something that you find in very well known vampire accounts. This strangling, hand marks, that kind of thing. There's also the fact that alleged vampires, would tend to harass people they like knew, family members, things like that. Um, so that's a minor issue, but basically the main point is blood sucking is kind of a later uh, it's a later idea that that's like solely the vampiric trait. Um, so it's there clearly in the 18th century. I mentioned that journalist who's like, well, they call them bloodsuckers. We call politicians and rich people bloodsuckers, whatever. So it was a thing, but I wouldn't say that during the main period when people actually believed in vampires in Southeast Europe. I wouldn't say most of them would have identified like vampire has fangs, sucks blood. Not really a thing. Okay. So in other words, as far as like the very original folklore type stuff, I don't see any reason to connect anti-Semitism to these guys. Most of them are guys. Some alleged vampires were women, mostly guys. Um, then we get to the vampire literature, and this is where I'm gonna sort of like no, but so the no is to the like origins of vampire lore, folklore, accounts from people who believed in them. There's a hard no there from me. But with vampire literature, we'll see. I think there's a little bit more argument there, and I will kind of steelman it while also giving the like sort of baseline argument. Um, where to start? Okay, the first vampire story that I know of, and many people apparently don't know of, which is fair because it's not very like it's not to everybody's taste. Uh, there was the story Opulence uh, in the book The Nightcap. I can't pronounce French names very well. I will refer you back to the previous essay I wrote, which talks about this at a little length. So Opulence involves a rich guy sort of losing all his. It's a very surreal, 1784 French. It's a little weird even for that, from what I know. But a guy gets rich from the Philosopher's Stone. Eventually, all the wealth is taken away from him by these so-called vampires who come in and take it from him. And in the end, one of the vampires kills him by sucking his blood. Yeah, I think I recall the exact wording right. It was translated into English in 1785. So that's pretty minor in the scheme of things. I'm not sure it had a whole lot of influence, but it is 30, 35 years before what a lot of people call the first vampire story, so worth knowing. So there is already a connection of vampires to rich. In this case, though, the vampires eat the rich. So a little bit of the opposite of like wealth hoarding, miser, whatever. Except they steal it. Whatever. It's a. I don't even know if it's a complicated story. It's just weird. All right. But the first vampire story that most people know about is The Vampire by John Polidori, which involves Lord Ruthven, just a great Gothic name, Slay. So Lord Ruthven is a wealthy, but perhaps fallen on hard times, sort of. Uh, well, he's a lord, like and he has, a bunch of wealth and stuff like that. Has a bunch of wealth, and he also like has a strange sort of generosity where he gives money to people who he thinks don't deserve it, and it ends up being like cursed. So in that way, he's like a weird. I guess it depends on if your morality aligns with him, whether you think that people deserve to be cursed, whatever. He has some association with wealth. The physical description of him that's actually lingered on at some length, Polidori lingers on it at the beginning of the story. It doesn't match up with any kind of stereotype you might assign to it. Um, but there's, the association with wealth that started with all the way back almost 100 years before this with that one journalist. Yeah, vampires are associated with wealth and some sort of perhaps Gothic, ruinous nobility, whatever. And Ruthven is certainly exploitative in his other ways. So we go through Varney, Varney the vampire. Not even going there. I don't. I don't think it's quite worth going into. It is also not worth reading. Please don't bother. So the fast forward from 1819, 1840s to 1871, with the beginning of the serialization of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which I have probably read, setting aside like religious texts, I've probably read Carmilla more times than just about anything, even more than The Merchant of Venice, which I study. a lot. I've read Carmilla a bunch because I teach it, so I read it, a bunch of semesters. So I think this is where the sort of slightly early Steelman comes in. I've not seen anyone make this argument, but I'm going to make it because I think it's kind of interesting. Um, there is a case to be made that Carmilla has some association with a fear of some kind of integrated foreign religious oriented other. And I'll just briefly go through this. There's going to be spoilers for that story. I'm not sorry. And a lot of people will say it was published in 1872. That's not entirely true. It was first serialized in a magazine from 1871 to 1872, and then republished more famously with very few differences in the short story collection In a Glass Darkly. So its publication began in 1871. Okay, don't at me on this. Um, so Carmilla has this beautiful young woman who shows up out of nowhere. It's very mysterious. One of the people who's initially seen with her is like kind of like Oriental or whatever. Um, so there's some degree of sort of foreign exoticism from the start of the main narrative. There's a few occult references in the story. It's kind of normal for Gothic. Those are obscure. Look it up. It's easy to miss them. So she has a couple of strange traits. She avoids the time at which the Christians around her. So Laura is the main character, or Laura's family are Christians. Carmilla doesn't get up till really late, which makes sense. Just like, oh well, they're gonna find out she's a vampire. She gets up really late, but it's Laura makes a specific point that she never saw her pray, and that makes sense from later vampire lore that vampires avoid signs of Christianity or whatever. That only slightly comes up in the vampire folklore, but it becomes a pretty definitive deal in movies and stuff going forward. But that kind of immediately is interesting to me that Carmilla does not pray. There's also a later part where there's a funeral. Gosh, I should have checked this, but off the top of my head, I think it's a funeral for a girl she had actually killed. Um, she and Laura sitting, having a nice time, whatever. Carmella's pretty fragile during the day, so she has to have a lot of rest, whatever, like, relatable queen. So I was sitting there, and Carmilla is really displeased by the singing that accompanies this funeral procession. And she doesn't like it. She implies that it's a sort of foreign religious thing to her. And she gets really mad about it. So that would seem to it makes a point that she's a religious other, but not quite a religious other in the sense that she's like wearing a Magen David. I was just Star of David. I was realized I'm wearing the Tree of Life, so she's not wearing a Tree of Life. I guess it maybe comes up in it, but whatever. So Carmilla maybe starts this trend of Jewish coded vampire other. I don't think Le Fanu would have been familiar with like Jewish assimilationist stuff going on in the century, like in that century and a century earlier uh, on the mainland in Ashkenaz, Central to Eastern Europe. He probably wouldn't have been aware of assimilationist Jewry. But one could make some kind of case, especially because the fear of like undercover beautiful Jews, whatever. I mean, that's the topic of my dissertation. I could go on about it. I won't here. But one could make a sort of, again, phenomenological argument. There's ideas in common. One could make an argument like that Carmilla has some amount of actual Jewish coded stuff in it. I wouldn't hold it myself, but there's your Steelman. And notice the Steelmaning argument that I would make is still over a century after the sort of folklore stuff that people have alleged, vaguely alleged. But then we get to the real core of when anti-Semitism did come in, and I think a lot of people sort of read Dracula back when they're observing all of the history of vampire literature and stuff. That is an anachronistic approach. It's understandable if you're not uh, as much of a nerd about vampire stuff as me. It's not a very common area of study, even in academia. It does come with its occasional very glamorous benefits like getting to do public engagement on Twilight, which I'm excited for. Uh, but yeah, understandable that a lot of people would think of Dracula as like very representative of vampire history, and it's in some ways yes, in some ways not. And we also, it's helpful, we know a lot of Stoker's precise sources, influences. Those don't come up too much, except keep in mind werewolves. So Dracula, published 1897. Bram Stoker wrote the thing. 1897. I was negative 100 years old, so I was not there for it. The first vampire film had actually come out the prior year, 1896. Uh, so Dracula is actually pretty obsessed with like the risks of modernity, all that stuff. People think of decrepit old castles. Yes, that's in the first part of it. Later on, there's a lot of like modern transportation system talk and things like that. So it's fitting that movies were also coming out at the time, but movies don't come up in it. Just why I shouldn't go on about it that further. The historical background for why Stoker was obsessed with Jewish stuff. Let's say he had a few Jewish questions. Historical background is really precise, and this is part of the reason why there wouldn't have been a whole lot of impetus for, say, like Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, 20 some years prior, to consider Jews too much. So historically, there was a major wave of Eastern European Jews fleeing westward in the 1880s. This had, I guess, technically the reasons for it had started in the 1870s. Jews getting, pogromed all over the place in Ashkenaz and Eastern Europe, and then they start coming into Britain, which Stoker doesn't like. So, authors prior to this wave, there wouldn't have been that direct influence, which is not to say they wouldn't have been anti-Semitic, um, but they wouldn't have had as direct, like an obsessiveness in that this precise way that Stoker did. So, 1880s, he's getting mad about that. He worked at the Lyceum Theater. The Lyceum Theater is, yeah, whatever. I mean, I mostly know about the history of the Lyceum Theater because Stoker worked at it. But his boss at the time was Sir Irving. And Irving was very famous for putting on a uh, run of The Merchant of Venice. And it sort of established this like sympathetic Shylock. And I've studied The Merchant of Venice so much, I'm going to try not to go into that too much. I've gone into so many things too much so far. But Shylock in Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, especially from a modern angle, can be read pretty sympathetically. Certain things that we read as sympathetic now weren't necessarily, audiences at the time probably wouldn't have had the same framework as us in many, many ways in reading The Merchant of Venice. So things that can seem sympathetic to us were probably played off for laughs at the time. Don't know Shakespeare's intentions, but the audiences would have received it differently. Anyway, Irving, big time Shylock performer. And then Stoker's pretty interested in it. He writes some notes about it. Some people interpret these notes as similar to his description of Dracula. I used to buy into that more. I'm not going to go into it too much and read off my screen a bunch during this, but I don't really find that as direct as I used to. I had a paper rejected from a journal where I sort of just straight up said, like, oh, his notes are sort of uh, like a clearly possible basis for Shylock. And the reviewers were like, you make some grandiose claims, and this is one of them. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's fair. That's not as established. Really good feedback I got from them. So, yeah, I mean, regardless, Stoker's pretty obsessed with Shylock. And when it comes to Dracula itself, we see a lot more overt anti Semitic tropes, and then we'll get to the actual Jew who's in the novel. Um, my notes are like down here, that's why I'm looking. So, a couple of things that are a little bit more directly Jewish ish about Dracula, as far as like the Eastern European Jewish immigration thing goes, he has an Eastern European foreigner who is trying to buy up real estate in England, and he's associated with like filth and rats and things like that, even though he's very like regal himself. He also can blend in, if we go back to the sort of Carmilla fear of like crypto Jewry, he can blend in. That's something that, if you've seen a lot of movies with Dracula, he often doesn't necessarily look blendy inny, but in the novel, he can blend in. He can also go around during the day. That's it's a normal thing until movies. He can go around during the day in the novel. So he also has a hoard of wealth that's possibly ill-gotten and it's like out of circulation. It's just like this rusty pile of stuff that's gathering dust in his basement in his castle, as Harker finds out. So, couple more things in common there. His appearance is a little bit stereotypically Jewish, things like that. Um, so thematically, there's a lot more argument to be made, uh, especially from the sort of immigration direct parallel there. But this is one of those things. So people often debate, like, is this author anti-Semitic? Is this work anti-Semitic? Uh, T.S. Eliot comes to mind for this, where people are like, are these poems of his anti-Semitic? And then you read like one of his books that's like mildly obscure, and he's just like saying Nazi stuff. The sort of, was he anti-Semitic based on these potentially anti-Semitic things? While there's an actual anti-Semitic thing, let's be real. Similar thing with Stoker, and well, Dracula specifically, where a lot of people will debate, this figure of Dracula, but then they ignore that there's an actual Jewish character who is an anti-Semitic trope. Okay, so his name is, I always forget, Hildesheim. This is late in the novel, which is maybe why people don't care about it as much. They read the first part with the castle, and then they get bored with the rest of the novel, which is actually where it gets more interesting. Whatever. Other people are allowed to be wrong. They'll deal with the consequences in the afterlife. Anyway, total joke there. The bad joke. Hildesheim comes up later in the novel. He is just kind of like a, I don't know, amoral figure or whatever. He doesn't play a huge role. He's not like a consistent villain, but he comes up and he's named as Hildesheim. And I have the exact quote of how Stoker describes him: a Hebrew of rather the Adelphi type. Okay, calling Jews Hebrews not anti-Semitic at the time, it seemed kind of outdated now, but that's pretty normal. Okay, what is the Adelphi type? And this isn't all about Hildesheim, that's kind of anti-Semitic coded. Literally just open the Gutenberg version of Dracula in Command F, Hildesheim. You'll see what I'm talking about. So a Hebrew, rather of the Adelphi type. The Adelphi theater was not the Lyceum theater. The Adelphi theater, think about it as maybe like a grindhouse. We also don't have those anymore, cinema wise. But it was like the trashy theater. There was actually a name. The Adelphi Screamers are like these lowbrow melodrama plays. Um, so calling him the Adelphi type is kind of implying that he's some sort of like uh, stereotypical figure out of a melodramatic, scary play or whatever. Okay, so Hildesheim himself is in it. There's not a whole lot of reason to think that. I almost said Shakespeare. God forbid. There's not a whole lot of reason to think that Stoker wasn't thinking of specifically Eastern European Jews when he was writing this, because there's one right there, an Ashkenaz, an Ashkenazi, and Ashkenaz. So that's the point at which, like, yes, obviously anti-Semitism creeps in with Stoker and his weird little obsessions. I would say that Stoker is kind of, once you get to know his work more, he's kind of a Lovecraft figure in how much his personal neuroses seep into his fiction. Um, so he's afraid of like the new woman, and so he has her he has the new woman figure die brutally, and so on. It's a very it's sort of a psychological self-study, unintentionally, but yeah. So at the point of Dracula, things start anti-Semitism enters the picture. There's a few arguments also to make about early modern Jewish tropes or early modern anti-Semitic tropes coming in. This is where I mentioned the werewolf thing. A lot of folklore didn't distinguish between werewolves, vampires, witches. You see this in the closest thing that the Jewish folklore tradition has to vampires, the strees or estries, where they're this sort of witch vampire hybrid. Whatever. There was a lot going on. There were, in some traditions, there were like living vampires and undead vampires. It is an alien area of study to a lot of people who, understandably, do not spend their time reading vampire lore. Um, so there was this idea of like, what do you even call it? A stereotypical comparison of Jews to like wolves, ravenous wolves. This is sometimes called the fanging Jew trope. It comes up in The Merchant of Venice, for one thing. So there's some reason to think that those sorts of images suffuse Stoker's neurosis. But yeah, there is some association of like Jews have fangs. This wasn't a literal belief, but a metaphor. Um, One thing that I will close with, because I think it's interesting. I always find this interesting that Irving, Sir Henry Irving, was more sympathetic to Shylock than apparently Stoker was, as far as I would guess. So there's a great paper on this. I did not know about this. Alessandra Bassi, great paper. Check it out in the show notes. There's the title of the essay. She talks about how Nazis wanted to like restore the Merchant of Venice to being actually anti-Semitic, as opposed to sort of looking broader contextually, the more like Irving approach to it. And I think that that's just an interesting case study of how one can think and rethink through these things. Um, Stoker took it in the more Nazi direction. Not that he was a Nazi. Um, I don't know what his take would have been if he had one on like predecessor movements. But yeah, I think these influences can go in various different directions. However, just to summarize, in the end, as far as I can tell, there's no defensible position about anti-Semitism having influenced the origins of vampire folklore and stuff. But there is a very obvious reason to think that it started playing with uh, Dracula. There afterwards, there's more complicated uh, stuff about vampires and Jews and like literature and stuff like that. But for Dracula itself, there you have it. If you're thinking of Dracula as the origin of vampire stuff, you're wrong, but you're not wrong to think it's got some anti-Semitic stuff. So this went on a really long time. I'm also not going to edit it, so I'm not sorry. Um, yeah, so I might write a little bit more formal on this. I'm definitely going to write about the witch thing that I hinted at early on. Uh, so teasing that post femcel femininity will continue. The Passion of Blair White will be out at some point. Whatever. Anyway, this has gone on too long. I just got angel numbers of 3333. So bye. Thank you for coming by, and you're welcome.